Apology from La Condesa, Part 3. I must explain my political experiences that paralleled my religious experiences. When I was 10 years old, I was surrounded by the sound of conservative talk radio, Fox News, and proud Republicans denouncing the actions of the godless Democrats. During the Obama-McCain election of 2008, my dad went to volunteer at the local Republican headquarters, and I went along as well, as I was interested in doing my part to save America. By my own volition, I began setting up political yard signs while my dad made phone calls encouraging people to vote for McCain, the late Republican senator, and other local candidates. After a couple days, I asked to make phone calls as well, and they allowed me as a fifth grader to call a list of voters in my community on the landlines, like phones attached to the wall. And they had these phones at the Republican headquarters. I was able to speak clearly and make my prepubescent voice sound a bit deeper. So it worked out. But people were shocked when they heard I was 10 years old. I thought I was making a positive impact, and the Christian world around me seemed to think that God was so clearly on the Republican side. Indoctrinated by Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity, news anchors, and other boomer conservatives, I was overwhelmingly nationalists, American exceptionalists, pro-war, pro-police, pro-death penalty, pro-traditional marriage, and deeply concerned that America is going to hell in a handbasket, and they are coming to get us. These are all loaded terms that mean different things to different people, but it isn't important to debate them here. My point is that this mixed with my evangelical Christian environment of doomsday prophecies, a persecution complex, and a dualistic mindset of God is with us and the others are evil to bring forth a toxic combination. I already had within me deeply rooted fear, anger, idolatry, insensitivity, self-righteousness, a desire for control, a superiority complex, xenophobia, etc. And in my experience, my daily consumption of conservative media and the surrounding of politically charged, fear-based rhetoric brought out the worst in me. It called it good, and it weaponized my woundedness towards a hatred of the proverbial other. This was, of course, in clear conflict with my identity as a beloved child of God, as Jesus commanded me to reflect the love of God toward my neighbors and even my enemies. I managed to stuff my cognitive dissonance away, helped in large part by the fact that the adult Christians around me seemed to have the same nationalist, fearful, xenophobic attitudes. So I thought I couldn't be that far off. At that time, I sincerely thought that Christianity and the Republican Party were kind of two sides of the same coin. I continued volunteering for the Republican Party every election season, being paid in pizza and donuts. And during my freshman year, I would faithfully ride my bike 8 mile round trip to the Republican headquarters a few days a week to make phone calls, encouraging my neighbors to vote for Mitt Romney, who was a presidential candidate, whom I met once in person, and other local candidates. At age 14, I was even handed a list of voters to visit by Republican Party strategists, and I walked around my town, often alone, going door to door, promoting our local candidates. I attended the Tea Party protests, which were organized by authoritarian nationalists masquerading as libertarians. I volunteered in governor campaigns for Chris Christie, the New Jersey governor. But by the end of his reelection in 2013, I had begun deeply questioning my actions, my motives, and the Republican and Democrat parties in general. At age 15, I thought I would eventually go to university to work in politics, but instead, my deepening awareness of the loving way of Jesus, combined with a growing disillusionment with electoral politics, to pull me away from my idolatry, and it sent me into months of prayer and introspection. In those days, I had a good amount of time on my hands. And why was that? Well, as I mentioned, I'm passionate about learning, but I despised being a student in K through 12. I felt like a prisoner more than a willing participant, being bossed around and told to sit down, be quiet, learn things I didn't care about, and to not be permitted to invest time in things I did care about. I also faced minor bullying from students and staff, and I had trouble making consistent friendships. I was an honors student in freshman year, but being absent as much as possible. And then all summer long, I felt a rush of anxiety and fear in my gut every time I thought about having to go to high school again for another 540 days, 3 school years. On the first day of sophomore year, I stood at my front door with my backpack on, paralyzed in despair. It was one of those life-defining moments when adrenaline kicks in, you get tunnel vision, and you realize quite clearly that the placement of a foot in one direction or another will determine the course of your future. As I heard the school bell ringing from afar, my decision was already made. And I sat in anxiety all day, frightened that I made the wrong decision. Of course, I could have shown up on the second day, even if I missed the first. But every day I remembered just how hopeless and depressed and alone I felt in high school. And my mental defense mechanisms worked overtime to keep me away from that perceived danger, wherein I may have spiraled into poorer mental health. My mom encouraged me to at least try going for a day or two. And in hindsight, I should have at least tried going, but I doubled down and decided I would not go. Over the years, a series of questions and doubts had built up, and I had time to process through them. The typical ones, any thinking Christian either processes through or shoves out of their mind for years with distractions. Is God real? Did Jesus really exist, die on a cross, and rise again? Is the Bible reliable? Do miracles happen? Etc. As I brought these curiosities up to the Christians around me, I was met with trite, unhelpful, remarkably ignorant responses. Many people were dismissive, saying, just have faith. Others would show me some online article defending young earth creationism, that is, the concept that God created everything in 6 24-hour days a few thousand years ago. They would explain how there was a literal global flood and that dinosaurs roamed the earth simultaneously with humans, which seemed to disagree with most scientific sources I found online. Being naturally analytical, skeptical, and endlessly curious, I would have become an agnostic at that point had I not discovered Christian apologetics. I found plenty of people on YouTube, especially, that seemed to be intelligent, thinking, reasonable believers. I was introduced to logical arguments for the existence of God and to a convincing defense of the reality of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. I read C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, and William Lane Craig. I listened to weeks worth of debates between atheists and Christians. I learned how, apart from the existence of God, there is no grounding for objective meaning, purpose, value, or morality. Atheism leads to absurdism and thus to nihilism. I consider that I would have to hedge my bets, like Pascal's wager, on some belief. And I considered the reason, evidence, and experience available to me at that time to be sufficient to bet my life on Jesus Christ. Thus, in the context of all these experiences, after a period of confusion, grief, reevaluation at age 15, I chose to surrender my whole life to Jesus Christ. And I dove headfirst into Christianity and ministry and reading what Jesus said, what Jesus did, and what Jesus called us to do. I chose to live radically for the gospel, to trust God deeper, to sacrificially love and serve others, and to expect the miraculous. I used to spend time being alone or playing video games, but I redirected that time to get involved in multiple churches, youth groups, prayer ministries, and my high school Bible club. I was hungry for more of God, excited to serve, and eager to learn from those with more experience. For years, I played video games like Halo, Borderlands, Grand Theft Auto, and I had some really fun moments. But I also wasted a lot of time on them. But it was the mindless coping mechanism I had and allowed me for socializing in a relatively safe environment with a variety of people. I was active and even became a recruiter in a gaming community called United Extreme Gaming. And I changed my Xbox name, gamer tag, to UEG Nacho Cheese. And it all feels pretty cringy when I reflect on it. By the end of my sophomore year, at age 15, I desired to know God more, as I said, to engage local in-person community and to love and serve my neighbors instead. For the sake of Jesus, one day I never turned on my Xbox again, laying it all at the foot of the cross, as Christians say. When I was a teenager and in my 20s, the music I listened to was a variety of what they called indie or alternative rock, which was, of course, influenced by my brothers and the culture around me. Some of my favorite bands were The Strokes, Two Door Cinema Club, The Shins, Fleet Foxes, The Black Stripes, The Black Keys, Cage the Elephant, Modest Mouse, Group Love, Vampire Weekend. They Might Be Giants, Sufjan Stevens, Wilco, Radical Face, Gorillaz. And as I mentioned before, in those days, I began reading a lot more. In the past, I had only read the books assigned to me in school or on my own. I read the Chronicles of Narnia, which I enjoyed for the plot and discourse. I was never really interested in fiction because I don't have an imagination. But I love the writings of C.S. Lewis, and over time, I read everything from the Narnia series to Mere Christianity, The Four Loves, God in the Dock, A Grief Observed. In the absence of any competent spiritual direction in the local churches, I think C.S. Lewis was the closest I had to a spiritual director in my early years of spiritual formation and ministry. And it's in part due to C.S. Lewis that I chose to take a risk on being a Christian. I think the most effective strategy of apologetics, in my experience, was first creating a fear of atheism or naturalism or nihilism. Second, positing the slight plausibility, not certainty, of the Christian narrative being true. And third, inviting the hearer to take a risk on the chance that Christianity is true. Of course, the type of Christianity they pitched was a heavily cherry-picked, negotiated, and sanitized version. The apologists often became professional sophists, only exploring ideas with their preferred answer already in mind. For example, as C.S. Lewis explained, but if naturalism were true, then all thoughts, whatever, would be wholly the result of irrational causes. Therefore, all thoughts would be equally worthless. Therefore, naturalism is worthless. If it is true, then we can know no truths. It cuts its own throat. And my fear of irrationality, relativism, and nihilism was my biggest reason for wanting Christianity to be true. I wanted objectivity, logical consistency, and a coherent worldview. If it weren't true, perhaps all this suffering and struggle would be for nothing. Perhaps life would be absurd. And Lewis, among others, painted a beautiful picture of the grand narrative of Christianity that I wanted to be a part of, taking a risk on Jesus, hoping for God to eventually reveal himself to me. Another book was How to Make Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, which was a gift from my dad and gave so many helpful pieces of advice that I continued to utilize. For example, you can make more friends in 2 months by becoming interested in other people than you can in 2 years by trying to get other people interested in you. I also read 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership by John Maxwell, which gave a variety of principles that I drew on extensively as I served in leadership. I still remember the example of the law of influence. Like leadership is about influence, not the title, or the law of connection, that you show people you genuinely care, or the law of the big mo, like build momentum and ride the wave. I also read Anthem by Ayn Rand, which was a short fiction book about a gifted individual who is being dominated by authoritarians with burdensome and nonsensical rules, but who eventually overcomes. And I read other books by Rand, which were formative for me. Rand championed the dignity of the individual and argued that people should be free to pursue the life that they chose. and that we ought not to be enslaved to some ruling class pretending to represent the will of the collective. Through each individual peacefully pursuing their own goals, everyone would be benefited. No utopia could be created through the violence, the domination, and the oppression of the state. And as individuals, we are not merely some tool to be used by the ruling class or some collective. You and I don't owe anything to society or to the state for existing, and they have no legitimate claim over our lives. My favorite book was Capitalism, The Unknown Ideal, which had a collection of brief essays laying a blueprint and addressing the questions of how a society free of systematic violence, oppression could work, and how free markets would lead to the greatest flourishing for the most people. Sadly, the economy of the modern US was unrecognizable as anything like a free market. It was being dominated and smothered under the boot of the ruling class, and the state was weaponized to enrich a small elite. I was probably attracted to Rand in large part due to my individualistic culture and personality. And also because I saw so much harm being done by idiotic collectivist control freaks. I determined that although I believe in equal rights, I recognize that the majority of people want to be dominated, controlled, and told a list of black and white rules rather than being a unique and thinking and innovating individual. And I absolutely hated being thrown into a collective, having my personal identity erased and being held back by arbitrary and unnecessary rules. For example, in school, I felt like those who excelled should be allowed to excel. We shouldn't have an anchor around our necks forcing us to be chained to the low performers, the unskilled, or the unintelligent. To be clear, Rand didn't advocate for some sort of isolated, rugged individualism, but rather a life of peace, cooperation, and mutual aid. And while I never bought into her philosophy, she taught me the importance of a healthy skepticism, objectivity, and of always diving below the surface in a debate to examine the premises of any argument or ideology. It's also important to mention George Orwell in, for example, 1984, which described a fascist and dystopian future that I believed we were actively moving into. Animal Farm also described the process that revolutions take, often being a circle in which one type of authoritarianism circled back into another type of authoritarianism. Another classic I read was Huxley's Brave New World, which describes a type of tyranny that's actively consented to and accepted by the population for the sake of comfort. Entertaining and drugging ourselves so much that we don't care if we live under a repressive regime. And I sincerely believed at every point that we are living in and moving toward a dystopian future, similar to those described in books like these. Other thinkers that were influential for me were Frederick Bastiat's arguments in The Law, which called out the ruling classes for trying to be above the rules and morality of the rest of us, as they carried out the same crimes, oppression, and extortion as common criminals, only legalizing it and calling it taxes or the law to give their actions a sense of legitimacy. The state is not some magical leviathan, but it's made up of imperfect flesh and blood people who are no better than you and I. Another was Stefan Molyneux, who taught me how we already live in a state of anarchy today, as we are free to choose this or that in almost all of our lives. And he laid out a coherent and practical plan of how we might eliminate the state from the areas where it has a monopoly on our lives. Instead, having a free market in the police, the courts, the military, etc. That was probably influenced by Robert Nozick also. Additionally, another author, Larkin Rose, taught me how the superstitious belief in authority had created such endless destruction in the human story, and how if we were to let go of this belief, authority for the sake of authority, we could stop entering into so many horrors of collective mass murder and domination, as we've seen with everything from slavery to the Holocaust to the Khmer Rouge. That doesn't mean that a mechanic isn't an authority on cars, or that we can't voluntarily choose to submit to an employer, but that some buffoon in a suit has no more legitimacy to boss people around than you or I. The damage caused by authoritarian regimes wasn't caused by Mussolini, Stalin, or Hirohito personally. Though they were evil, the damage was done by everyday people like you and I, who were just doing their jobs. If we stopped mindlessly obeying orders, like the police and military always do, we can move beyond the unspeakable horrors we've witnessed in the past and that are still continuing today. I also read Camus' The Stranger, and later The Plague and The Myth of Sisyphus. I was always intrigued by existentialism, and I spent days contemplating questions of meaning, purpose, and value. The idea of accepting nihilism always haunted me, and I dismissed the idea of creating your own meaning as absurd compared to the objective meaning I thought we had found in the Christian God. Regarding my spiritual life, one of the most influential books was Thomas à Kempis' The Imitation of Christ, which I read and listened to 100 times, and which, other than the Bible, was the basis of my understanding of the spiritual life. One of his instructions that became central to my life was to never be entirely idle, but either be reading or writing or praying or meditating or endeavoring something for the public good. Crucially, I had read my grandfather's copy of Bonhoeffer's The Cost of Discipleship. And that call to radical discipleship in the context of a culture that was openly authoritarian and anti-Christ was a fundamental book in my development. And along with his other book, Life Together, Bonhoeffer largely set the path for my Christian life and ministry. I chose to come and die, surrendering my whole life for Jesus Christ, trusting my future, my finances, my safety, etc., into his hands, not worrying for myself, but believing that Jesus would make everything work out in the end. As Bonhoeffer says, the cross is laid on every Christian. The first Christ suffering which every man must experience is the call to abandon the attachments of this world. It is that dying of the old man which is the result of his encounter with Christ. As we embark upon discipleship, we surrender ourselves to Christ in union with his death. We give ourselves over to death. Thus it begins. The cross is not the terrible end to an otherwise God-fearing and happy life, but it meets us at the beginning of our communion with Christ. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. And so that's what I did.